Hi, I wanted to talk to you guys some about plot. Plot is the events that happen in the story in fiction. And so what we're going to do is talk about plot, specifically these five terms here: exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and denouement. Those are the typical five terms people talk about when talking about plot. Plot is a way of measuring tension in the story. There's always conflict. Within the story, you've got several different possible conflicts. Some potential conflicts. You've got human versus human. Human versus self. Human versus self is where instead of fighting with another person or a conflict between two people, one person might be in conflict with themselves. They may think they're in conflict with someone else, but it's really maybe their lack of motivation or their selfishness, which is keeping them from achieving, keeping them from moving on and progressing in the story. Some characteristic of themselves is holding them back. There's human versus nature. A lot of times, human versus nature often works a lot like human versus God, particularly in the 19th century, in the 1800s. It was very popular to have stories where nature would represent God. So, for instance, in Scarlet Letter, you've got Hester Prynne. Hester Prynne is this girl who has sex with the priest, and she has a baby out of wedlock. But the real conflict of it is somewhat human versus self, somewhat human versus God. The conflict is about how the priest basically shames her publicly and makes her go live on the outskirts of town, even though he doesn't own up to what he did. Because he knows if he did, he wouldn't be a priest anymore. So he lies and tells everyone that he doesn't know who did it, but she's a harlot and immoral. So when really he's the immoral one who pressured her to have sex. So you've got this issue with human versus God. He's going against God's will. And there's a scene where in the middle of the novel, where they meet in the middle of the night, and she tries to plead her case and be like, "Listen, why are you doing this to me? This really isn't cool." And God sends a meteor shower, which scares the priest. And the point of the meteor shower is that God's angry. So that would be an example of human versus nature, where nature is a representation of God. There's also human versus society. Human versus society is where you've got one character whose values are at odds with the values of the society they live in. For instance, that could be maybe someone trying to fight against racism or sexism. The society is set up in a way to work against that person, and the person has to fight against society and change the way society is. So whenever you've got the conflict is a source of tension in the story. And plot is all about creating tension, building tension, and measure. And these words measure tension. These words over here are refer to when tension happens in the story. So you've got exposition is anything that happens before the story begins. So it happens. Sometimes you'll see exposition in flashbacks, or references to events that happened in the past. So someone has a memory, and their memory is of something that happened before the start of the story. That would be exposition. Rising action is events that happen in the story that cause the tension to increase. The climax is when the tension is at its highest point. Falling action is anything which causes the tension to decrease. And the denouement is what happens at the end of the story. Like, they happily get married, the person gets an A on their test, they die. It's basically kind of what happens at the end. When it's all over, when there's no tension left, what causes there to be no tension? That's the denouement. A lot of times when people think of it, they kind of imagine it being kind of like, okay, here's your exposition, and then you get some rising action, you get your climax here at the top, then some falling action, and then you get a denouement once there's really no more conflict. That wouldn't really be how most stories are, though. If you get exposition, the exposition is going to be over here. So, for instance, and not every story has exposition, and not every story has a denouement either. So, if you've got something that causes there to be conflict before the story, it's going to be way back here. You'd flash back to in terms of time. If this is our like X-Y axis, where Y is conflict and X is time. So then, but you're going to have some different events in the story that are going to cause there to be conflict. Here it's almost a climax. Here's your climax. But the tension's going to rise and fall several times. These friends have a fight and you think that they're going to not be friends anymore. But then something happens and one of them buys the other one ice cream and takes it over to their house. And then all of a sudden they're friends again. But then the one who took the ice cream over gets invited to do some dog sitting. And while they're dog sitting, the dog runs away and the person's really angry and then they're no longer friends. So here would be the dog runs away is our climax. And then all of a sudden we see the tension come out of their friendship when they're like, get out of my house. And then all of a sudden their tension's gone. Because there's a lot of falling action really quick. Boom. So once you hit that climax, usually the falling action happens very quickly. And of course, sometimes it can change. Sometimes you'll start with a flash forward. A famous movie called Sunset Boulevard, for instance, begins with the climax. It begins with the narrator is dead. It starts often with a first-person narrator kind of talking about what's going to happen in the movie. And as he talks, you see him floating dead in a pool. And all of a sudden you see the cops take this actress, and she comes out of this mansion, and they have her in a straitjacket, and they're taking her away. And the rest of the story then becomes about what caused her to go crazy and kill him. But it starts with his death and his murder. And then you have to go back and find out what caused the rising action. So sometimes people can mess with different parts of the story in order to get different effects. But this would be the typical kind of way a story would look or think about it. Is you've got an event which causes the tension to rise, then the tension will calm down for a little bit. Then it'll rise a little more, calm down for a little bit. Rise a little more, calm down a little bit. Climax, follow. So think about that when you're thinking about your story and what you want to happen in your story. And when you're writing a first draft, you might not think about it that much. You might just be kind of like, oh, well, I can write the story and kind of see what happens. But as you're going through and working on changing it, improving it, making it into more of a story, you might want to think about, well, what scenes are really important. When you've got a lot of tension, it tends to slow things down. Like if you're watching a movie and there's a part that's in slow motion, a lot of times it tends to be a really big part, important part in terms of the action of the movie. That's because it's a high point of tension. Writing works the same way. If you're writing and then all of a sudden you start adding a lot of details and things like that, a lot of times it's because the writer wants you to pay attention. They think it's an important scene. They want you to pay attention to that specific scene. That's why they slow it down. Whereas scenes that go by really quickly tend to be things that are less important. Things you might need to know for the story to go along, but they aren't really related to the tension. Because the tension is where our theme's going to come from. the conflict. So think about what the conflict is, what scenes you want to add tension, and those might be scenes you want to add a little bit more to. If you're finding that there's only like one scene with tension, think, is there anything else you can do to build the tension? Does it need to be built up anymore? Is the one scene enough? And for a short story, one scene might be enough. You might want more than one. It just kind of depends on what the story is, what you're trying to achieve with it. So hopefully this educated you a little bit about kind of thinking about plot and tension and conflict. And I look forward to seeing what you guys do with this information and writing your own stories. Thanks.